Let's take a minute and pray. God, we thank you for your word as it's been preserved and the things we can learn from it. As we're here today, we want our hearts open that we might embrace the things that you've given and grow in them and pass that growth on to whomever you give us to share. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Boys and girls, and we here will be studying the Bible book, the Old Testament book of Esther. Let me give you a little bit of background on the book of Esther. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are already familiar with it? Okay, and it's not everyone, and that's pretty normal. Esther is not the best known of all the Bible stories. And there are Bible stories that really ought to be known better, but somewhere along the line, we do want to learn this one, because it brings its own teaching about character that comes with faith. It's one of the last books of the Old Testament to be written in terms of what it did in history. And to put that in perspective, I almost have to do a quick summary of the history. The Old Testament story is the story of the Jewish people from the beginning of the covenant with Abraham, way back early, right up until they were torn from their home, were healed in their repentance, and then brought back to their home. And basically that happens at the end of this Old Testament story. And then the Old Testament rounds itself off, and there's a little gap, a few hundred years between the end of the Old Testament and the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, the beginning of the New. This comes very, very late in that story because Abraham first heard the call to follow God around 2000 BC, give or take a couple hundred years. I know that sounds kind of funny, but people aren't sure exactly when it was Abraham's turn to hear from God, and some had it a little before the year 2000, some had it a little after the year 2000 BC. And for our purposes, it doesn't matter that much, except that it's really interesting to know that the Old Testament covenant time was roughly 2,000 years, and the time since Jesus' birth, the time of New Covenant, is roughly 2,000 years too. It gives you a nice symmetry and a nice perspective about what's going on in the Bible. And the story of the Old Testament people in the Old Testament was a lot like the story of the lost son, the prodigal son that Jesus taught. Someone who was called and given an inheritance, a blessed inheritance, and as long as they were faithful, that was fostered and blossomed. When they turned their back on the calling, then they began to lose the benefits. The beautiful time, the most beautiful time of the Old Testament was, I think in the eyes of most of us, the time of David and Solomon. And again, something that's really nice to know there is that from the time of Abraham, who first heard God's call and who was the first Jew, the first Old Testament covenant person, until the time of David and Solomon, David was on the throne exactly in the year 1000 BC. I won't say he was anointed that year, but he was on the throne that year. So the real glory days of Israel under David and Solomon's kingship was at and just after the year 1000. And then over the next couple hundred years, people of Israel did bad things. 10 of the 12 tribes turned their back on God, separated from Jerusalem. They had something like a civil war. And 10 of the 12 tribes lived as one nation in the north. They called themselves Israel. And the remaining 2 tribes surrounded Jerusalem and the temple. They called themselves Judah. And that went on for a while, but the northern bigger kingdom eventually fell away and was destroyed by pagan kings. Jerusalem and the surrounding area held on for another about 140 years, and then they too, by their unfaithfulness, were destroyed. Jerusalem was burned to the ground, the temple was destroyed, and the Jews who were living in Jerusalem were scattered all over the empire of the pagan king who destroyed them. That was the king of Babylon. And they lived for a lifetime that way until God raised up another empire, the empire of Persia. And Persia destroyed Babylon, and in God's great plan said to all the people who'd been scattered around the world, all you who have lost your homes under the king of Babylon, you can go home. And so all the Jews under the king of Persia were able to start going home again. And they got home, they rebuilt the city, they rebuilt the temple, and thanked God that He had given them mercy. And then they looked for the long-term deliverance that would come through the Messiah. That's the story of the Old Testament in a nutshell. You hear individual stories of heroes who helped bring that about. But the Old Testament story is the story of the people. Their rise when they were faithful, their utter fall when they turned their back on God, and their healing and being brought home when they repented and trusted God anew. That's the story of the Old Testament. The story of Esther comes pretty much at the tip end of that whole long Old Testament story. Because Esther and her uncle Mordecai were living in the capital of Persia. It was some time after Babylon had come and destroyed Jerusalem. It was actually several generations. And Babylon was history by then. And when the Jews were able to go home, not all of them got home. Some of them lived where they had been moved to. That was true for New Testament times too. Jews stayed wherever they'd been moved to. And Esther and her uncle Mordecai were living in the capital of Persia when the story of Esther unfolded. The king in the story of Esther, if you read the story, you'll find the name Ahasuerus. He's more famously known as Xerxes. And you'll hear that from world history books too, King Xerxes of Persia. And so a lot of people will revert to the name Xerxes because it's easier to pronounce, easier to connect with folks who don't know the Bible well, and it's just a good frame of reference. So they'll often talk about King Xerxes. If you ever hear the name Ahasuerus and you want to be adventuresome and learn how easily to pronounce it, God bless you. But if you don't, that's the same person as Xerxes. And he had an officer who comes into the story as well, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But what had happened was, by the time the Old Testament story was drawing to a close, the most powerful empire in the world was Persia. They were just getting challenged by the rising Greek empire that we know more about from world history as the New Testament story ended. So we hear about Persia. Here's a man named Mordecai. Now, sometimes it sort of skips a few generations when it sets the setting. If you ever read the book of Esther, you'll find it says something about Mordecai coming with the Babylonians. Actually, Mordecai was of a family of people who came with the Babylonian exiles, and he was a great-great-grandson or whatever of one of those, and ended up, instead of going back to Jerusalem, he ended up moving from Babylon to Persia. As a lot of Jews did in those days. So he was living in Persia. He was part of a whole lot of minority people who were living in Persia. They weren't Persian citizens exactly. But Mordecai, even though he lived far from Jerusalem and far from his homeland, he was a very faithful Jew. The Persians, like all those other empires, had their own pagan religions. Some were really forceful about them and made them a requirement for you to be a good citizen, and some of them were more tolerant, and the Persian Empire was more tolerant. They didn't mind if you had your own faith. It was all right. In fact, they encouraged you to practice it. That's why the Jews got to go home after Babylon built their temple. He nonetheless was not a Jew. He was a benevolent king overall. But like a lot of kings in the ancient East, he also had his pride. And the story of Esther unfolds with Mordecai simply living there faithfully as a Jew and faithfully as a supporter of the king. And there came a story at the very beginning of Esther where King Xerxes had a wife whose name was Vashti, and he threw a big party that went for a week or more. A party that probably involved a lot of feasting and drunkenness. We don't know that for sure, but it probably did. And somewhere in the middle of that several days long party, King Xerxes said, "I want to present my wife, Vashti." And so he sends and says, "Vashti, come to the party and I'm going to present you to them." Well, Vashti didn't want to go. She said, I'm not going to your party. I don't want to really be a part of your party. I'm not coming. And when that word came to King Xerxes, he was ticked off. And I have to say, there are two levels where you have to really hear the story of Esther. On the one story, it's an account of drama and courage that we'll get to. On another level, though, the story of Esther is infused with ironic humor. It's intended to be taken with a serious lesson, but with a whole lot of humor built in, sewn into it. You ever see the musical play Fiddler on the Roof? Yes? Okay. Well, that's a story about a Jewish man living in a non-Jewish territory. It's a story that has both tragedy and comedy infused together. And that's really, if you understand the story of Esther in 3 dimensions, it's the same thing. It's got drama and it flirts with tragedy, and at the same time, it's full of humor. So, on this level, on the one hand, it's a very serious thing. King Xerxes is offended that his wife said no. But on the other hand, the storyteller, whom God inspired to write Esther, enjoys telling you some other things too, because when Mordecai gets ticked off and he wonders whether he's got his perspective right, he confers with all of his advisors. Maybe you can hear this. I didn't know this. I didn't pick up on this dimension of it until I was in school studying the book a little more carefully. But when he talked to his advisors, they got really concerned because they said, not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials and the peoples who are in the provinces of the king. For if this deed of the queen will be made known to all the women, it'll cause them to look with contempt on their husbands. Since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she didn't come, so we won't either. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that they may not be altered. Vashti will never again come before the king. And let the king give her a royal position to another, who is better than she. So, when the decree is made by the king and proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. So there is both drama and humor built into this moment. And King Xerxes says, you're right. We've got to protect the husbands across our empire to have rule over their households. So we'll make an example of Queen Vashti. She's banished from the kingdom, and I'm going to find a new queen. So the word goes out. The king's going to start over. He's going to find somebody who is eligible to be the queen. And as the story unfolds, there were women from all over the empire who were candidates to become the new queen of the Persian Empire. Mordecai had raised this little girl, Esther, who was an orphan. He had raised his niece as if she were his own. And she taught her to be a lady, and he had taught her to be a good, faithful Jew, one who honored the living God. Mordecai worked in the capital, and he was aware of this. In fact, he was very loyal to the king. They recorded a moment when an assassination plot against King Xerxes developed in the capital, and Mordecai got word of it. Almost nobody knew about the plot. Mordecai did, and he tipped off the guard of the king so that he was saved before the assassins could get to him. He really cared about the empire that he lived in. So he was faithful to his capital land, and he also was faithful to his God, one who did God and country both for his context. And he raised Esther, this young girl, to be loyal to both her country of residence and to her living God. And when the offer came for people all over the empire to be the new queen of the Persian Empire, Mordecai suggested that Esther should allow her name and her presentation to be among those who were candidates to be the new queen. And it took a long time. It took several months to round up all these people. And they went through a grooming process. It's probably what we might imagine some of these pageants are like, Miss America or Miss Universe or whatever they were. It would be something like that, but amplified because it wasn't just a beauty contest. It was a responsibility to the whole empire. And so, yes, it took several months or more to find the right person. And of all the people across the Persian Empire, Esther rose to the top. The beauty, the character of a lady, and the character that's drawn from faith all combined to make Esther stand out among these many, many women who hoped that they might become the queen of the empire. The king chose Esther. What a beautiful thing. And even at that point in time, I'm sure that the first hearers or readers of the story of Esther would say, oh, how God has blessed, and there's a great moral victory to faithfulness to God and service to your land. And when you do those things, you can rise to a place to be a blessing to other people. It's already at that point that Esther is chosen as queen that a victory story is found for the Jews. But there's a lot more to the story. Because, like any classic story, it has a villain. And the villain is an officer, one of King Xerxes' advisors. His name is Haman. Hebrew speakers might say it Haman, and I might say it either way as I go. Haman or Haman. He was an officer of the king, a very ambitious man. He also appears to have been pretty vain. He wanted attention and honor. He was like a lot of those insiders that you hear about. It's like, you hear the phrase in our country, all the president's men, and you have this vision of ambitious people cutthroating each other to try to get to places of great power and influence. Well, Haman was one of those. He served King Xerxes, looking for his chances for a big break so that he'd become more famous and more powerful. That was what drove Haman. Well, very early in the story, something rough happened. When Haman had a declaration, he had the authority for a declaration given to him to have everyone greet and honor him when he walked through the street in public, and many would bow and give their great praises to Haman. Well, that went against Mordecai's principles. Because Mordecai, as a faithful Jew, understood that the only person who really deserves that kind of awe and reverence is the living God. And any faithful Jew will say that there is no human being who holds a candle to the true living God, and I'm not going to do obeisance and bow and make a big fuss that looks like worship for anybody but God himself. So when Haman would ride through the streets and people would cheer and yell and wave and bow, Mordecai wouldn't. Now Haman's wired to be ambitious. He's glory hungry. Who's that person out there who won't honor me? He's a person of some importance to the eyes of some folks because Mordecai, after all, was a good patriot, and he had turned in the would-be assassins before they could do their dirt on King Xerxes. So he was respected. And when Haman sees a man who is respected in the streets not giving him his due honor, Haman gets mad. Who is this guy? And somebody tips him off. Oh, this is a man named Mordecai. And he won't do that because he's a Jew. And Jews don't believe that anybody deserves that same kind of honor except God alone. Well, and I think Haman kind of thought along the same lines that Xerxes did, if this word gets out, all kinds of people are going to not respect and honor me in public, and I've got to make an example of him so that they'll understand how vital it is to their security to honor me. So, Haman inquires, and he learns that Mordecai gets his value system that kind of disses Haman in public from his Jewish faith. And of course, most people in Persia are not Jews. There's, oh, these weird people that believe in one true God, and they won't give due honor to all the royalty and all the VIPs. They're weird. And we're going to make an example of them. And I'm going to put Mordecai in his place. I'm going to put all of his people in their place so that this kind of teaching doesn't go on anymore, and people are going to honor me the way they ought to. I won't be singling out Mordecai, and it might be hard to defend that in the king's court since they know that he saved the king's life. But if I go after everybody who's like Mordecai, then he'll be a face in a crowd, and I'll be looking to do the king's image of service, and my image too, and eliminate all the people and all the teachings they represent from taking honor away from these places and these people, me included. So, you've got these two things running, and they're like a train wreck. They're going to hit each other somewhere. Esther has been honored as the queen, the most worthy woman in all the empire of Persia to be the queen. You've got her uncle Mordecai, who made her, as a human guide, parental figure can, made her who she is, who has the contempt of one of the king's officers. There's a train wreck going here. And in the context of the train wreck, there are a couple of pretty good little humorous asides going on. Haman, at one point, thought, I'm going to get myself really good attention and honor in the streets of the city. How can I do that? I've got to get some advice. Now, while Haman is thinking this, at the very same instant, the king can't get a night's sleep. He's troubled. And you know, when you can't get a good night's sleep, you have what we call insomnia. You try to come up with remedies, whether it's a TV show or music or something to read, or you try to find something. Well, the king couldn't get to sleep that night, so he asked some people to come in and read to him. And what they brought in to read to him was a recent history account of someone who had saved his life from being assassinated. And he hears the story and said, the guy that found those assassins and tipped the honor guard that they were coming is a hero. What can be done for such a man? And while he's trying to think about how to honor somebody, in walks Mordecai looking for the king's advice on how Haman, I said Mordecai, didn't I? Haman, the villain, walks in looking for the king's advice as to how to get attention to himself when he goes through the streets of Jerusalem. There's one of those little humorous wrinkles that happens in the story because while the king's trying to figure out how to honor Mordecai, Haman comes in thinking, oh boy, how can I get the king's advice on how to honor me? So in walks Haman. And the king in his sleepless night says, well, Haman, he beats him to the question. And he says, tell me, Haman, how would we honor someone whom the king wants to honor? Haman doesn't know that he just heard about Mordecai. Haman thinks to himself, well, I know who the king wants to honor. So here's what you do. You get a horse that the king rode on, and you dress up the horse, and you get an honor guard to go before the horse, and you parade them through the streets and have a special day when the parade happens so that everybody in the capital city can see this grand parade with this wonderful person on a horse that the king has rode himself, and it's all dressed up, and everybody declares in the parade through the streets of the capital, Here is the one that the king delights to honor. Haman had gotten to carve out the program for his own parade with the king's blessing. Except that he didn't know why the king was asking the question. And the king says, this is what you must do. Or he says, okay, Haman, that's a brilliant idea. Go to it. Dress up that horse. Find it and put the honor guard in front and make sure all the things that are announced in the streets of this great parade. And make sure you do these great things for Mordecai the Jew. See to it that you lead the parade and tell everybody in the streets. And so there's a wonderful moment in the book of Esther where Mordecai is walking through the streets with this wonderfully decorated horse that he thought he should be on, announcing to all the world, here is the person that the king delights to honor, Mordecai the Jew. Wonderful moment of irony. Well, this really gets Haman mad. Haman is furious, and he goes home and tells his family. He thinks, I've got to get to the Jews, and I've got to make Mordecai pay. And now it's rub salt in the wound, I've really got to get to Mordecai. And so he comes up with a plan. He goes back to the king sometime later, and he says to the king, did you know that there's a group of people living in the empire who don't honor you as their king? They just honor some god out there, and they're not good citizens, and they can't be trusted. They're known for being rebellious, and they won't bow down to you or salute you or me. Now, king, I would like to eliminate this kind of thinking from your empire so that your empire has good morale and unity and a great vision of what the Persians can be. So I'd like to eliminate these people from the face of the earth, or at least as far as the empire goes. The king says, I see your point. Okay, Haman, you're in charge of the project. You can go after these people. Here is my seal. Here is my approval. You go out and eradicate these people, these evil people, from the face of the earth. Of course, he had slandered the Jews when he made his presentation to King Xerxes. But he was authorized to do this thing to Jews all over the world. And he goes and prepares his letters and sets up everything to execute his plan. And he has a special little treat for Mordecai. He has a gallows built where Mordecai can be hung. And so personal example can be made of Mordecai. He has his plan wonderfully in place. Well, of course, Mordecai is close enough to the king's court that he gets tipped off of this. He says, what a terrible, terrible thing is about to happen to God's people. You know, we hear, in retrospect, about what happened during World War II to Jews in Europe. Maybe not by raw numbers, but by scale of world empires. It was similar to that. It was a similar kind of purging that was going to be done. Mordecai got wind of it. He was horrified. And so he did what Jews will do in a time of crisis. He stopped eating. He put on grieving clothes. And he prayed every day. And he passed the word out so the Jews all over the empire would be doing the same in an appeal to God to rescue them from Haman's wrath, authorized by the king. Now the king apparently didn't know that Mordecai was a Jew. And what he certainly didn't know was that his selected beloved queen was a Jew. But he had authorized their destruction just the same, because he took Mordecai's word for it. The Jews were bad people. Now there's an awful crisis. And Mordecai would do anything to save not just his own life. It wasn't just about Mordecai. It was about all the Jews. Otherwise he wouldn't have notified them and told them all to do the same, to pray and fast and put on grieving clothes. So all over the empire, Jews were tipped off that this needed to be done before something really awful happened. And then Mordecai says, send this message to my niece Esther. Haman, an officer in the king's court, wants to destroy us all. You are in a better position than anybody in the whole world to stop this. Will you appeal to the king? Now this is tough. Because on the one hand, Esther is the most favored woman in the whole empire, and she was chosen personally by King Xerxes to be his wife and his queen. But on the other hand, King Xerxes has just given Mordecai permission to destroy all Jews. Did I say Mordecai again?
Haman.
Thank you for understanding. He gave Haman this permission to destroy all Jews. So when Mordecai, her uncle, sends her this message, she is in a real bind. And she sends a message back to her uncle. She said, you know, maybe I am a person of influence and honor, but I'm not the king. And the only way I have a right to make any appeal to the king is if he calls on me first. If I go into his court without his having called on me, I'm subject to the same law, even though I'm queen. That if he doesn't give me a pardon, I could be executed. I don't think I can do this. And so everything's in stop action. Mordecai gets this message from his niece. And he says then some of the most famous words in the book, and some of the best words, probably a summary of the lesson of the book of Esther. Mordecai sends a message back to Esther saying, don't think that in the king's palace you'll escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Maybe you've come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. That's pretty good. Esther at that point had to consider all the things, wonderful things that had happened in her life that had put her where she was, and needed to stop along the way and say, but why? Why am I in this place, and what am I going to do with the prestige and influence I do have? People need to ask that question. So many times, and in our land, sometimes it happens blithely. People will get on some TV show and say, oh, I've been blessed. Look at the great things that have happened to me. Everybody says, yeah, boy, you're famous and you're comfortable. And we don't stop. We don't stop to think something that Jesus said in the hills of Galilee a generation or two later. He said, of those to whom much is given, much will be required. That's one of the recurring themes of Jesus' teaching that so often get forgotten. Of those to whom much is given, much will be required. God bless the folks that wrote the script for that Spider-Man movie about 15 years ago. The overarching theme of that Spider-Man movie was, with great power comes great responsibility. That was the slogan of the movie that carried through for several years. Incidentally, if you're in at all to superhero movies, that was one of the most implicitly Christian superhero movies ever made. It's worth a watch. Well, that's Esther's position. Who knows? You may have been given these great things for a reason, and this may be the reason. Queen Esther prays and fasts and comes back and says, send this message to my uncle. Please have all of the Jews praying for me. I will go into the king. If he kills me, he kills me.
You're leaving Wednesday.
But
Yes.
I'll go.
Not till evening, though. We don't think.
And she went to the king, not knowing whether he would accept her into his presence, knowing that she could be called treasonous and executed if she just walks through the threshold of his throne room, but she goes. And she lays everything on the line. In some ways, it would be a great thing to stop right here and just let that sink in. You put your whole life on the line, not knowing whether you will be honored or destroyed. But you know that the stakes are high. And when God has given you all these blessings that we celebrate, it's for a reason. And now you've embraced the reason, and everything's on the table. Which way will it go? Well, the king said, "What is it, dear Esther? Tell me what's on your mind." That's one of the great turning points of this wonderful story. The king received her and protected her. Now, Esther had a plan, because Mordecai had told her that it was Haman who had instituted this plan. She knew Haman. He was in the king's court. So she said, "Okay, my plan is this. My dear king, can we have a banquet together? You and me and your officer Haman?" That's a wonderful idea. Let's do that as soon as we can. So they all get together, and the three of them have this exclusive banquet. And Haman goes running home and says to his family, "Guess what? Queen Esther herself had a private banquet with her king and invited me and me alone to her banquet." He said, "Wow, this is great news." And at the banquet, the king said, "Is there anything more that you wanted?" She said, "Yes. I'd like to have another banquet with you and Haman tomorrow." That's a great idea. So in they go to the next day's banquet. And there's the king and his beloved Queen Esther and Haman, all three of them together. And the king says, "Do you have a request in mind that we've had these banquets together?" And that's when Esther springs her plan. She says, "Yes, I do, because I'm in danger, my king. And my family's in danger. All my people are in danger. All across the world, my people are in danger because somebody wants to exterminate us all. All of us, me included. My life is fragile because of an edict that has flowed through this empire." Well, the king who loves his dear queen says, "What a terrible thing! Who would ever do such a terrible thing?" Let me tell you. It's this man right here having dinner with us. Haman has executed the plan to destroy all Jews in the world, and that'll be all over the place in the empire, and it will be my uncle who raised me, and it will include me, myself. We will be destroyed because of Haman's plan. Oh boy. Talk about the moment when the jig is up. And the king is white with anger, and Haman is white with fear, and Esther is waiting to see what will happen. The king leaves the banquet in fury. And Haman feels utterly helpless and overwhelmed because he didn't know that this would affect the queen and that the king would react so violently to it. He is in shock. And he realizes now that if the king comes back and cancels out his plan to destroy the Jews, Haman's life is on the line. So while the king is out trying to cool down in the garden, Haman runs up to the queen and he collapses on her couch with her sitting on it, pleading for his life. At that moment, the king walks in from his rage and says, "What? Will you assault my queen on her own couch? Guards, get this man and kill him." And the guards come in and they say, well, if you wish, how do we kill him? Well, find a place, find a gallows or something. Haman built a gallows for the Jew Mordecai. Good! Hang him on that! Yes, there's tension, but don't you sense the ironic humor? So Mordecai was hung on the gallows he built. I'm sorry, I did it again. Haman was hung on the gallows he built for the Jew Mordecai. The tragedy that he arranged for Mordecai was carried out of himself. The honor that he wanted for himself was bestowed on Mordecai. All this irony wrapped into the whole thing. And at the climax of the story of Esther, not only is she and her uncle and all the Jews across the empire spared, but they are given permission with an edict from the king to seek out and wipe out all the enemies who would have destroyed the Jews. There are at least 2 days set aside to do that. And that's the last great irony of the story. The plan that was out to destroy them ended up destroying their enemies. In response to the story of Esther, the Jews have an annual holiday. It's called Purim, P-U-R-I-M. It's a day to celebrate their deliverance from their enemies and their opportunity to turn on those who would have destroyed them. They carry out that annual feast, and they do it on the inspiration of the story of Esther and her heroism. Because when she walked into the king's court, for all she knew, she was going to be thrown in prison and executed. This is the story of Esther. It's a beautiful story. It's a dramatic story. It has ironic tragedy in it, and it has ironic humor in it. It's one of the richest stories, and you are really supposed to enjoy both. Now, if we are teaching our children, they may not get the ironies. That's saved for adults. But it's there to be enjoyed and to give you perspective as you share it. And it brings to us eternal lessons that we want to remember when the whole story has been told, and we consider its legacy for our lives. And that is, of those to whom much is given, much is required. And we need to be willing to lay our lives on the line for the Lord who blesses us. Sometimes it's scary. Sometimes it's very risky. But it is how God's truth and His love for faithful people gets manifested when people of faith are willing to take whatever much or whatever little the Lord has provided them with and lay it on the line that His cause may be upheld, even more precious than our lives. God will honor that. Of those to whom much is given, said Jesus, much will be required. And He also said that of those who do, it will be enriched, blessed, like a rich grape crop, pulled in, put in baskets, shaken down, running over. The blessings of God will honor those who invest and risk faithfully. With confidence, we can take that lesson with us and share with each other and share with our children and our children's children, so that every generation of faithful people, however comfortable or however harassed in the world they may be, will nonetheless hold a candle in the dark night of this world's brokenness, and faith will go on as long as humanity does. That's what we're about. Thank God for one more true story that brings us there. Amen.